Welcome to tonight's webinar, What Does Impact Have to Do with It, with Jessica Clark. And I'm Cassandra. I'm a digital media coordinator at NBPC. And I made this announcement before, but I just want to make sure that everybody got it. So first off, if everyone here, except obviously Jessica, the presenter, could please mute your mic, that would be great. And the mic is top left of the GoToMeeting control panel. And if you're calling in, if you could mute your phone, just to minimize feedback, background noise, so that we don't have any distractions. And at the end, Jessica is going to be taking some questions. So please, if you think of a question, feel free to type in to the chat box at the bottom of the GoToMeeting window, whatever your question is, and we'll monitor those and we'll give them to Jessica during the Q&A period. So one more quick announcement for everybody considering applying to our 360 Open Call, which is NBPC's Program Development Fund, where we incubate and fund pilots for broadcast and web content. We're going to officially start accepting applications on February 1st, which is actually less than 2 weeks away, if you can believe that. So mark your calendars, and you can also find out more about the program at blackpublicmedia.org. So, as Jessica is going to discuss in her presentation, funders of content like to see the work connecting to a real-world audience. And as a producer, there are certain tools you need to accurately reflect the impact that your story is having on the real world. So tonight's presenter, Jessica Clark, is an internationally published journalist, researcher, and media futurist whose work connects thought leaders across many disciplines. In 2013, she founded Dot Connector Studio, whose first client was Media Impact Funders, a knowledge network for foundations supporting media in the public interest, where Jessica is now research director. And she served as media strategist for the Association of Independents in Radio and as a member of the core team for the National Public Media Transformation Production Localore. She also led the Future of Public Media project at American University's Center for Media and Social Impact, and she's developed research and convenings with NPR, PBS, CPB, Harvard's Berkman Center, USC Annenberg, MIT, and others. Some of her previous clients include the Smithsonian, Learning for Action, and us, NBPC. And as a writer, Jessica's also very accomplished. She co-authored Beyond the Echo Chamber, Reshaping Politics Through Networked Progressive Media. She was executive editor at the magazine In These Times, and she's written for PBS Media Shift, The American Prospect, and other outlets. And she's also served as a source and speaker for conferences and outlets such as ABC, PBS, Newsweek, and the BBC. So, without further ado, here is Jessica Clark.
Thanks so much, Cassandra. I'm excited to be working with NBPC again, and I'm looking forward to talking to all of you. I hope you'll apply by February 1st. So what does impact have to do with it? What does this mean? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot by funders, to some smaller extent by media makers, and definitely by advocates and others who are interested in the social impact of documentary film. You heard a little bit about who I am. What I'm doing right now, in addition to working with media impact funders, is I'm working directly with interactive producers who are working on documentaries that span we call it the air, screen, and street. So broadcast, but also interactive and face-to-face engagement. I've been thinking about impact now for about a decade. Started as a magazine editor, did a ton of research into how journalists, documentary filmmakers, radio producers, and others think about the way that their work moves out into the world and moves people to action. I spent a lot of time deep in the complications, and now I'm moving towards trying to make it as simple as possible. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll feel more comfortable and less confused. So as a former journalist, here's where I start. When working with a client or starting to work on a production, simple questions that every journalist learns first year of J school: what, where, why, when, how, and who. So who is your audience? A lot of times filmmakers or interactive producers will think primarily about what their project is, either because they want to make a film or because they have a particular story to tell. A lot of the research, however, and a lot of the thinking over the last 5 years has been around how to reconfigure this process in light of the fact that we all have access to all kinds of participatory media, and we're all much more empowered as media consumers. So when you're thinking about your project, you should be thinking about that little guy in the corner and the people that he's pointing at, the ones who are actually going to consume it. And it's not the public, even though some of you might be aiming towards public media, because that's too broad. You really want to be thinking about audience segmentation, and it's not just Black people, even though it's Black public media, because not everybody's the same. It's hard to get demographics, though, for films. So that you sometimes have to do some guesswork. You sometimes have to do some imaginative audience prospecting. You can do this by sitting down. There are a number of tools you can use to develop user profiles. You can have informal focus groups to talk through your storyline and talk through your roughs. There's different ways to do it. If you are doing a digital first project or a project that's going to have a strong digital component, you should become familiar with the tools that are free, living inside of the platforms that we all know and love, that allow you to get basic demographics about your users. And you should be developing your user base in advance, not just after thinking about it after the project is done, but from the very beginning, the communities that you're trying to address, both as potential fans and ambassadors and as people who can offer an informed perspective on what you're producing and how it should roll out. Partnership is also a really useful way to think about audience development and the relation, the fit between your production and the impact that it's going to have in the world. And the partners that you choose will shape your outreach campaign, but it might also potentially shape your editorial content as you go. So you're going to have a very different project if you're targeting educational institutions as partners than if you're targeting cultural institutions or opinion leaders. And that'll be informed in part by what your topic is and how it relates to your target audience. But topic is only one thing. More importantly, you have to think about not what, but so what? Why does this thing matter? Why does your story need to be told? What's going to happen next? Who cares? Sounds harsh, but if you ask yourself those questions, your production is going to be better. So here's one way that you could think about this that I put together for media impact funders, this what's your so what? And another sort of term of art or jargon, depending on your opinion, that you're going to hear being thrown around is what is your theory of change? So this is the most simple possible theory of change that you can have. If we make this thing, then the following thing will happen. It's kind of like a Mad Lib for impact. And this is a rubric for funders, so it runs the gamut. All kinds of different possible types of media, all kinds of possible different types of audience, different genres you can see in the how column. And then it starts to get really hard and interesting and complicated over in the to track and the impact columns. So the to track column is ways of thinking about how you're actually going to gather evidence around the way that your production is making its way out into the world and reaching people and what happens next. And then the impact is your ultimate goal. So you can actually work this diagram from the beginning if you know what you want to make, or you can work it from the end if you know what you want your impact to be. So it's a little bit of I like to think of it as kind of like a football playbook. You can get out your chalk and draw on it. Where is another way to think about how to segment your audience and target your project. So obviously, if it's about a particular location, there's going to be a built-in audience and also a built-in limitation. Distribution how many people can you reach across how many continents, across which platforms. All of those things are going to help you determine how to think about your audience and your outreach strategy and your distribution strategy over 3 to 5 years. Is it possible that what you're working on is going to get aired? Is it possible that it's not going to get aired and it's only going to make its way through film festivals or through universities or through advocacy organizations? Are specific partners central to your distribution strategy? All of these questions are going to help you think about your impact and how your goals and your narrative and the stories that you're telling relate to what happens next. And then when? So, Cassandra, do you know if the people who are on the phone are at the beginning of their process, or is it all over the map?
I would say probably all over the map. So, um, if you could address a wide audience, that would be great.
Okay, so the best possible thing would be if you were just starting from a blank page and you were thinking about impact from the beginning. But most of our lives, they don't work that way. So the question is, where are you at the moment in the thing that you've been developing and producing? What's the next stage? What is the stage after that? How are you benchmarking it? And how are you addressing each one of these elements in the strategic design? So this is one of a couple of models. You saw one that I showed you before, the what's your so what slide. This is another way to think about it. This was developed over a period of months with several documentary case studies of films that had been in production between 3 and 20 years, average 5 years. And this is the simplest possible schematic we could come up with for what it takes to try to build a high impact production and understand what we mean when we say impact. So this borrows a bit from software design, the idea that you have to do R&D at the beginning, and you have to think through all of these different elements, not after the film is made again, but as you go. Who's going to fund it? What are your goals? How do you make them measurable? What are the many different platforms across which your work is going to be made available over time? Who are your partners? What are the challenges? And you may not know all of this initially, but it's good to come back to this and check in every 3 to 6 months. Not just reach, which is the most common way of thinking about distributing something, but also, are you trying to reach particular influencers? Are you trying to build a network around your story or around your issue? Are you trying to engage people to get them to do something specific? All of these things add up to impact over time. And impact is a moving target. It's a way of thinking about progress. It doesn't, most films or most media campaigns don't have one particular outcome. They have a series of targets along the way. So unless you're trying to change a specific policy or save a particular life, this is going to be a little bit of a messier process than you might want, but it's also very interesting. Here's another way to think about this. So this is very linear. This is not so linear. I created this with the Tribeca Film Institute, the interactive division, and MIT Open Docs. They brought together a whole room full of interactive producers who are now on a listserv. And we were talking about, well, how do you think about impact when you have a project that's being shaped by the participation of your users? It's not a linear process like this one. I mean, reality is not really linear like this either, but it's even less so. So it has a lot of the same elements, though. So over on the left, you can see what's your goal, what's your destination here in the map language. Is it engagement? Is it personal transformation on the part of the viewer? Are you trying to mobilize people? Are you trying to convene people around a particular identity or a particular issue? Who are your traveling companions? You see some of these same partners, funders. Really the difference here is the relationship, your contract with your passengers or with your audience. So this is a major conceptual shift for makers who think of themselves as primarily authors of a narrative that's fixed. Instead, you might have a very different relationship to your your viewers, your passengers. You might be building the road. You might be creating a public transportation system so that they can travel through your story from different vantage points and choose their own route. Each one of these choices changes your production process, changes your impact, changes your timeline, changes your trajectory. We tried to sketch out some of the common benchmarks along the way. Obviously, the launch, some of the questions you need to ask at that point, some of these landmarks that you may encounter along the roadway toward your destination. Although the question of having an exit strategy is often a problem for independent producers and filmmakers who start a project because they're passionate about the story and then find themselves embroiled 3 years later and trying to figure out either how to close it down or ramp it up. So this is meant to try to help you do a little forecasting. And these questions down at the bottom, the long trail, are questions that you probably are not ready to ask yourself now, but you might be ready to ask yourself someday. It's good to think about them in advance. We're still moving our way through the 5 W's and the H, so here we're on Y. These seem like they would be obvious questions, but not everybody asks themselves that. Who cares? What makes your project relevant? What was the catalyst? So your personal story in making the film is also often part of the impact of the overall campaign. And what do you want specific outcomes? And not every filmmaker does. Some filmmakers just want to tell a story. They think of themselves as artists. They think of themselves as journalists. So it's okay if you don't want to have some political outcome or some sort of particular group outcome. You just need to understand where you're situated and how to answer the impact question if you don't have a really clear goal. So this question of catalysts matters. So we can see very different catalysts in these films. American Promise, very personal film. It's about the filmmaker's son. They really committed themselves and him to this long-range documentary process. As a result, because the filmmaking was embedded in the process of his education and his friend's education, their targeting strategy ended up being around teachers, parents, and students. So the impact of the film and the catalyst of the film are tightly aligned there. For Through a Lens Darkly, Thomas Allen Harris, again, a very personal story, a story of artistic self-realization, a story about reconciling his identity within historical depictions of African Americans. That personal story led to an outreach campaign, which was very personal. It was about going out into communities, asking other people to bring their personal pictures in to be scanned into the historical record. So there's a direct line between his creative catalyst and the outreach strategy. And then Whose Streets? This is a film in production. Catalyst there was I think it was Baltimore. Sorry, I'm a little tired. It was the unrest that we've seen over the last couple of years around police brutality. Very much a story of mobilization and trying to capture personal experience. And the film is being created in the same collaborative spirit with people online, trying to really tell the story of the movement. And although they haven't entirely sketched out their campaign yet, it's probably going to have political goals. So you can see how these different origin stories relate to goals and impact, and how in thinking about your own production, you might be able to create these similar sort of pass-through points that relate what you're making to what happens next. So a lot of times, people think that impact means that you got an award or you reach the most people. And sure, that's fine. That's all good. But there are a lot of other ways to make an impact with a media project now in this networked participatory environment that we're all inhabiting. You might be trying to create a networked hub, like over on the left. So say that you're making a film about cerebral palsy. Maybe what you end up with is not a big Academy Award. Maybe what you end up is a really engaged group of people who care about that condition and can lobby around it. Maybe what you're trying to do is create a safe space. Maybe it's about, I don't know, transgender Samoans, whatever. People who are not quite ready to step out into the public sphere and have conversations about what they're experiencing. But you tell one compelling story, and that becomes a hub for people to have sensitive conversations that are important to them and can eventually move out into a different form of impact. Maybe you want to bring people together who don't agree with each other at all. So the bridge builder projects, those are designed to create frameworks that allow polarized publics to talk to one another across differences. All of these are different ways to think about what you're trying to accomplish and how to explain it to funders and to your audiences, because part of impact is telling the story of what you're trying to do and whether you did it or not. I've written and researched a lot about this. You can find out a whole lot more about it, along with many other tools and different frameworks at this URL, which I will come back to. Let me just see what else I got here. Oh, okay. Yeah, 1 second. So one more framework before I go back to that URL. Oops, sorry. This is one last way to think about these questions. Very similar to the ones we've seen before, but it just depends on how your brain works. We joke about this. Maybe it's an impact drinking game. Maybe it's an impact twister game. Basically, this is a spinner. It's literally, if you want one, you can email me and I'll send you a spinner, which has goals around the black ring. The colors are meant to indicate what kind of interaction it is with audience members. And then the outcomes are on the white ring. So this is a way of thinking through. The spinner itself also has things that you can measure that will tell you if you've achieved the outcomes. This is a way of thinking about what your goals are for the project, how to match up your different outcomes to try to figure out what story you're going to tell and how you're going to tell it, and what you're actually not trying to do. Because you can't do everything. If you did everything on this circle, you would lose your mind. So I'll end up with this slide, but first, a few takeaways. It's complicated. It's not, there's no formula. Believe me, we've all tried to write a formula for impact. There's no playbook. There are some attempts to write a playbook, but it comes down to your own goals. Often journalists and filmmakers don't want to hear any of this. Don't be afraid. I'm a former editor. It's actually fine. This is a good way to make your work better. If your big goal is social change, media is only part of the picture. It's part of a balanced breakfast. It's like an old commercial joke. You have to give credit to and understand the roles that advocates and policymakers and other people play in large-scale social movements. When you think about impact, don't think about metrics. I mean, you're going to have to collect metrics. Don't get me wrong. Everybody loves metrics. But really, it's this question that you're trying to answer. So what? What is your film doing? What is it saying? Is it beautiful? Does it move people to tears? Does it move them to action? And your audience is your best research. Learn about them. Talk to them early. Talk to them often. So more resources here. And I will stop there. Questions?
Okay, great. So, and yeah, I want to remind everyone that during this Q&A period, if a question occurs to you, please feel free to type it into the chat box, and we're going to be reading those to Jessica as we go along. So, yeah, take a moment, think about any questions you might have. A lot of information, really enlightening stuff in this presentation. So,
do you want me to go back to anything?
Well, okay, let's see. Does anyone have a slide that they want to see again? If you do, type into the chat box, just let us know, and we can go back. And actually, that reminds me. So some of the slides we're going to be posting on blackpublicmedia.org as well, so you can go back and reference them later if you'd like. But I see that Jessica, if you could go back to, if you can go to the resources page, I think there's a URL.
Oh yeah,
Um,
sure.
we can just dive into that.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so this is Media Impact Funders. This is a network of all of your favorite funders that you've heard about. Ford, MacArthur, Fledgling Fund, a lot of the major documentary funders are part of this. And the point of this network is to allow funders to talk to one another and to grantees about best practices. So this section that I edit, called Assessing Impact of Media, has a bunch of different options. You can search articles and resources around impact by topic. You can search them by type. You can search documentaries. People just want to hear about documentaries, but there's also other options too if you're interested in other forms. The conversation around documentary impact is pretty extensive. You can also just dig in, depending on how much of a nerd you are or whether you're looking for tools. If you're a nerd like me, you can look at the research section. Different kinds of ways of thinking about metrics. And here's a report that I worked on that's pretty relevant about how to, from the perspective of social change advocates, about how to use documentary film. It's a little bit of the reverse of what we're talking about today. And then articles is just trying to keep track of the latest and greatest metrics, discussions, and statistics, and interesting profiles like the impact campaign for This Changes Everything, which is a recent documentary film about climate change and economics. So yeah, plenty to dig into here.
Okay, great. And actually, we have a request for a slide. If you could return to the slide with the roadmap.
Okay.
And I think the request was that we wanted to just hear one more reiteration of those points, if you'd be so kind.
Okay. Sure. All right. So now there was a big debate on the listserv when we created this roadmap because even this was too linear for a lot of people. Let me just put that caveat out there. And some people mentioned an ocean and whatever. So take it with a grain of salt. But the idea is that when you are developing an interactive production, you have a lot of decisions to make that you might not have if you were developing a linear documentary. For example, you need to decide which of the many interactive platforms you're going to use. You need to decide what your relationship is to your audience. And we can go through this somewhat tortured metaphor here in the modes of transport box down on the bottom with all the funny little vehicles. If you have a machete, maybe you're going off into untested territory, like you're doing a virtual reality documentary, or you're doing an augmented reality documentary or something, and you're basically blazing a trail for other makers. And your user is following along. They're taking a risk and following along behind you on the trail that you're blazing. If you have a bicycle, like maybe you're using an interactive platform, but you're basically just telling a first-person narrative and people are clicking through it. The private car, that's more of like a proprietary interactive platform, still pretty linear. The user gets into the vehicle, into the virtual reality chamber, into the game, and they come along for the ride. It starts to get messier and more interesting depending on your tolerance with this ride share. So you're, in that example, you're bringing your users in as co-producers, as co-pilots. They're helping you to not only they're not only just navigating through a story that you've built for them, but they're helping to create the material as well. For example, Sandy Storyline, which was a post-Hurricane Sandy interactive documentary that was created to help document how long it was taking for them to fix the coast, is co-produced. A lot of the material that's part of that documentary is um, pictures and narratives from people out in the community who are living that reality. Public transport. So you're a conductor. So you're basically calling the stops. You're creating a platform that people can interact with, but they're not necessarily contributing to it. But it's a little bit more of an open-ended experience rather than stepping through from point A to point Z. Uh, the newfangled contraption. um, there are a lot of these. They're hard to describe. uh, let's see. Let me think of one. Um, if you go to Tribeca Interactive, for example, I was in a thing where a piano had been hooked up to a bunch of pictures, and then when you played a song, it would put different pictures up in different configurations. Okay, is that a story? Is that a documentary? Up for debate, but it's a newfangled contraption. I get in there. I tried it. The Caravan, this is about a bunch of different organizations or storytellers working together across multiple platforms. So you might be, as the producer, leading the caravan, but you're not telling the whole story and you're not dictating how the story is being told or which vehicles people are using. Does that make any sense? I know it's pretty abstract.
Yeah, I would say it does.
Okay. Okay, that's good.
We have
Um,
one more question actually from our audience, and
uh-huh.
so the question is, can you give an example of a project that didn't start out with a lot of support, and talk about how carefully tracking impact changed the media and founder response to it?
Huh. Let me think about that for a minute. I think one interesting example was Not in Our Town. And that was one of the longest ranging documentary projects. Started out as a sort of a localized um, uh, news documentary about activists who are fighting hate crimes. And the broadcast generated so much response that they ended up doing a second Not in Our Town, and it continued to not steamroll, snowball in such a way that the people who were fighting hate crimes in different communities around the country became the subjects of the next film, and then they became activists in their own right, organizing around the film as a kind of a hub, like I was talking about in the hub model, the network hub model. And then it became a national organization. Then they created an online platform, and on and on and on. And each phase was both um, informed by and covering the movement that they were spawning. So there was a sort of internal logic to the impact campaign. So the people who are who are telling the story are also making the story, and telling that story was bringing more support in over time and more participation.
Great. And actually, I have a quick question for you, just from the standpoint of somebody who works a lot with social media. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and this, stop me if this is the kind of metrics question that we're not supposed to ask, but so let's say you have a social media campaign as part of your strategy, which
Mm-hmm.
seems like a constant no matter what your impact strategy, really. So
Mm-hmm.
should you aim to go viral or have like a trending hashtag? Can you talk a little bit about how social media engagement influences or predicts the long term impact of a project?
It's Well, first of all, I would say that if you are aiming to go viral, you're going to be sorely disappointed for the most part because it's pretty hard to do and it's hard to predict. I think that the the challenge right now is that everybody's overwhelmed and we've all got a lot of social platforms that we've tried and abandoned, or we have particular people that we follow and we've given up following the rest of the people or whatever. So there, you can't necessarily add a lot of, you can't say if this thing is trending on Twitter, then it's a hit. You can say that if you say our goal is to get 1 million people to tweet Black Lives Matter or whatever your hashtag is. If that's your goal and you're doggedly pursuing your Twitter strategy to make that happen because you believe that raising awareness is your primary objective, and building a movement and creating a sense of affinity and doing all the things that that particular hashtag does, then yeah, that was success. But a lot of films, they don't necessarily lend themselves to a Twitter campaign because the people that they're addressing are not on Twitter. The people that they are, there are different age demographic usage patterns for different platforms. Like Through a Lens Darkly might do great on Instagram, but maybe it wouldn't do very well on Twitter because Twitter is not as visual. So it's not as simple as just try to make a big bang. I think it comes back to this slide. If you're trying to have a domino effect, if you have a strategy that says we need to pass legislation, on choose your issue, cancer research, and we think that the way we're going to get there is we're going to target the influencers, then we're going to build awareness, then we're going to pick a National Cancer Day, then we're going to rally our Twitter troops, and then they're going to contact their congressman, then the dominoes are going to fall. That's when you've had an impact and you've had a sensible social media strategy. You know what I mean? If your strategy is fan club, like say it's a documentary of an up-and-coming dancer, out of some new dance form, and what you're really trying to do is build awareness of that person, and through that person as sort of avatar, glean more support and legitimacy for that art form. Maybe you have a Twitter strategy that tries to get as many people as possible to like that person. It's like a typical Twitter celebrity strategy or Facebook strategy. So that outcome would be a win if you were able to glean a bunch of new fans from that person. So, it needs to be more targeted than just a big hit.
Okay, great. This is giving us a lot to think about, I think. And I'm seeing people are responding really well to the visuals from your PowerPoint. So
Cool.
thank you. And if that's it for questions, I think we're going to go ahead and conclude the webinar. And again, just to repeat, if you want to review Jessica's points and her slides, we'll be adding this webinar to our archive on blackpublicmedia.org, so you can come back and watch as many times as you'd like. Oh, actually, I see we do have one more question. Jessica, are you good with taking another question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the question is, how do you work the social media strategy into your budget, or do you?
You definitely do. Most people have minuscule budgets. So the first way to do it is to get an intern. You need to make the case, not only for social media strategy, but for metrics and analysis and evaluation as part of your overall production and development. So I think the bad way to do it is to put it in your promotion budget. The good way to do it is to put it in your audience cultivation and networking budget. And if you don't have one of those, you should think about putting one together, because more and more funders are seeing that as an intrinsic part of a documentary production. If the question is, how much does that cost? Yeah, depends on the scale of the production, and what you can afford.
Okay, great. Do we have any other questions? I know sometimes, you don't think of the question until you've processed some of the information, but um, if if we don't, then okay. I think oh, before we end, I just want to also add one last announcement. Um, so I want to add that if you like Black public media, then you'll love Afropop. So if any of you are not familiar with Afropop, the Ultimate Cultural Exchange, it's NBPC's documentary series about issues facing Black people worldwide. Um, and this season, which is happening right now, it's hosted by Jussie Smollett from the hit series Empire. And you can catch it on the World Channel on Mondays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So we encourage you to tune in to Afropop. So, with that said, thank you so much, Jessica, for sharing your
Hmm.
expertise with us. Um, and thanks to all of you for participating in the webinar. So have a great night.
You too.